around a little bit, make sure that we've got things up and going. I actually kind of like this as a different location for doing class because I get to sit on a super comfy um, mattress here in our guest room, and it's kind of a good way to set up. And I have a blank wall behind me, so y'all can't get too distracted by anything. So maybe that's a good way to go. Also noticing that the video went live, then went off, and then went live again. So I have no idea if anybody's able to see this. Anyway, so not that big a deal. If it's working, then great, and if not, it will shut down and tell me that it's failed probably about the time I finish up class, because that's how it usually goes. All right, glad you are with us this evening as we continue our study in the book of Colossians. We started 2 weeks ago and kind of working a little bit at a time tonight. I'm not sure, might run a little bit shorter because I'm trying to be very focused on just a handful of verses, but y'all know me by now. If I get cranking, then there's no telling what'll happen, and even though we're only looking at a handful of verses, we may run the full amount of time. I guess we'll find out once we get there. For anybody who's watching this who hasn't seen the first couple of classes, I recommend you go back and catch those. But if not, I offer a short introduction just as a reminder to everyone where we've been and what's going on in the city of Colossae that affects how and what Paul writes, and why that matters to us as we try to interpret Paul's writing here, nearly 2,000 years removed from its original audience and its original author. So, by way of reminder, the city of Colossae is located in the heart of what we know now as modern Turkey. Then it would have been Asia Minor. The area is hyper-Roman. Even though it is a long way away from Rome, they overcompensated for their distance by being super into worship of the emperor and all things Rome, which made Christianity a tough sell in a lot of ways, and it encouraged people who were inclined towards some understanding of Christ or Christianity to find ways to fit it into what they already kind of knew, practiced, loved, or find a way to take aspects of Christianity and just adopt it into their kind of their cultural customs and their way of life. And so that's kind of very present in Colossae. And the other thing to know is about 250 years, 200 years before Paul writes this letter, a large group of Jewish immigrants are moved by the Greeks, who kind of have their empire going at that particular moment, into this part of the world to kind of pick them up from Judea and relocate them to this location in the middle of Asia Minor. And so a Jewish community develops there that is away from the temple, and very hard to go back and make yearly pilgrimages. And so it kind of develops its own set of customs, still oriented towards God, but absent the temple and the sacrifices. It develops in kind of a unique way. And so we also find strains of some very, very traditional Jewish practices and emphasis on Jewish traditions that Paul is having to kind of guide or redirect in the book. The practice of taking bits and pieces of different religious beliefs or philosophies was very, very normal in the Roman world, and especially in such a pro-Roman, hyper-Roman part of the empire. It is in no way surprising that we find it there. It's called syncretism, and so you take bits and pieces and kind of synchronize it together in a way that is comfortable and familiar, and not disrespectful. The idea wasn't to tear down anything, but it was just to kind of make it work in their own way and in their own mind. And so Paul is left writing to this group trying to correct some of those tendencies. And those tendencies by no means have gone away today. We still have a tendency, I think, in our world to find ways to take the bits and pieces that are comfortable and ignore the bits and pieces that aren't. I've told the story before it was passed down to me by my dad. So for, Dad, whenever you get around to watching this, about a time when he made a comment either in a class or from the pulpit about something that was in the text, and somebody came up to him afterwards saying, "That's not in my Bible, that's not in my Bible," and it wasn't. They'd simply removed it. And for the fact that we may not be cutting stuff out, there's certainly things that I think we like to ignore. So by way of spoilers, this Sunday for church, one of those verses comes up. Woe to you who are rich, woe to you who are full. Given our preferences, we would prefer to be rich and full instead of poor and hungry. But the Bible challenges some of those tendencies, and Paul has to challenge some tendencies that he's facing with the church in Colossae as well. So we are today specifically looking at verses 15 through 20, and depending on how that goes, I may go ahead and jump ahead and include 21 to 23. But 15 through 20 especially are very different from the rest of the letter. And in fact, 15 through 20 have been one reason why a number of people throughout the last 250 years or so, a number of scholars, have challenged whether or not Paul really wrote this letter. And that's because it uses language and phrases that we don't necessarily see from Paul in any of Paul's other writings. On the other hand, the more you look at it, especially in its original language, but even reading it just in English, you can tell that it's highly poetic, and it's definitely different than instructive writing. And that's because we've got a pretty good idea now that this is actually one of the hymns the early church would recite, sing, I guess, kind of together. These are words that were very meaningful to the early church, and Paul shares them again, these words that they all knew, as a reminder of the centrality and supremacy of Jesus to the gospel. So in a church where people are finding others who are saying Jesus and or Jesus but, so Jesus is important, and so is this, and so is this, and you've got to keep these food laws, and it's very important that you, or Jesus, but we have this mediator between us and Jesus, and there are these other spirits and these other angels that it's important to. Paul comes back and says, no, it's Jesus. It's only Jesus. And you'll notice last week and this week, that's where Paul starts and spends a full quarter of this letter focusing before he ever gets around to dealing with the problems that they're facing, which he'll start in chapter 2, I think. Yeah. He starts with what is foundational to faith. And so what is more foundational to the Christian faith than Christ and the nature of Christ and the nature of Christ's work? So Paul writes, shares with them these words, verses 15 through 20 of chapter 1 of Colossians. He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. For in him all things in heaven and on earth were created, things visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or powers, all things have been created through him and for him. He himself is before all things, and in him all things hold together. He is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, so that he might come to have the first place in everything. For in him all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell, and through him God was pleased to reconcile to himself all things, whether on earth or in heaven, by making peace through the blood of his cross. So let's start with that, just verse 15. He is the image of the invisible God. The Greek word there is icon, and it means way more than just similar to or a visible reminder of. I think when we think of icons, we often think of images or logos being things that represent or stand in for. But that's not really what the original language is lending itself to. The idea of an icon in Greek, the way that Paul uses it here, is a full. I don't want to use the word representation because that's not it. It is the fullness of God is present and existent in this icon, in Jesus. It's not that he's a picture of God, it's that he is the presence of God. And maybe, yeah, that's the right way to say it. He is the presence of God. And so they don't need to be looking in other places, under other rocks, or in other philosophies, trying to find the other pieces to the puzzle. Okay, let's roll with that image because it just came to my mind, and maybe that's the best possible way to do this. So if you approach faith as if it's a puzzle and treat Jesus as if he is simply a piece, that leaves room for lots of searching for the rest of the pieces of the puzzle. And what we have in Colossae from a number of different directions, it's not just one idea and one voice, it's a number of them. They're all claiming that Jesus is a piece of the puzzle and claiming to have wisdom or knowledge of what the other pieces are. Whether that's traditional Jewish food restrictions and worship practices, or that's Greek philosophical thought rooted in this weird notion of eons and minor gods and stuff like that. That's what Paul is arguing against. And what Paul essentially says is, no, the puzzle is Jesus. Like, that's the entire puzzle. And the pieces of that puzzle are his faithfulness, his fullness, his sacrifice, his resurrection. Like, those are the things that you've looked for. And Paul will go on to say, and you've already found them. You don't have to keep looking. But you can see where, if you think there has to be more, or that there are other things out there to chase after, that would be very easy to do. And Paul's trying to start by making sure they understand that Jesus is the completeness, the fullness, the wholeness of what God has done, is doing, and will do. It's all already there. And then later in that same verse, we get this phrase, firstborn over all creation, which has tripped some people up through the years, because that gives the idea, if you read it at face value and translate it in that way, that Jesus is a part of creation. But the word really that is translated firstborn in my translation, but differently in some others, is really first over, with the emphasis on source of, or supremacy over, and definitely not giving us the idea that Jesus is simply a part of or a piece of creation, which is why the next words that follow that are, for in him all things in heaven and on earth were created, things visible and things invisible. And so again, it's another reminder that if you're looking for other pieces, you've already missed the point, because the fullness of God has already been present and offered himself as a sacrifice for us, and that is Jesus. And then he takes those ideas about the supremacy of Christ and relates it to things that they would have seen every day in their world, in their normal conversations, with these ideas of both visible and invisible thrones, dominions, rulers, or powers. And he's talking there both about earthly things and spiritual things. So the idea of angels or angelic beings or demons, anything like that, with a reminder that none of those things have power over Jesus in any way, form, or fashion. And so again, we don't know exactly what's going on in Colossians, in Colossae, in the church there, but we get the idea by reading these words from Paul that people have taken these elementary beings, these ideas of angels and demons, of spiritual forces, and turned them into some form of object of worship. Whether they're worshiping the angels or treating them as intermediaries, I'm not entirely sure, and I don't know. And Paul doesn't think it important enough to spell it out for us, nor would he have needed to for them, because they were experiencing it. They knew exactly what Paul was talking about. And he's simply reminding you that there is no power in the world greater than Christ. As cleanly, as simply as I can state it, that's Paul's point. That's the point of the hymn that he shares with them again here. And then relates all of that down to the church, the head of the body, the church, the beginning of the church. And then I love the phrase firstborn of the dead for a number of reasons, but there are a couple of different ways you can read that, and the one that I like, and I can't tell you that is exactly what he means or not. Sometimes just taking guesses and trying to get close. Or Paul is one who often writes with two meanings in mind anyway, trying to help you, understand bigger picture stuff. But Paul's also the one who reminds us that we have to die to sin and die to ourselves. And in some ways, we are then also born from the dead, even while we live on this plane of existence on earth. Once we die to sin, die to self, our resurrection in Christ is a rebirth, a resurrection of sorts. And so Jesus may play that first role as a guide and as a sacrifice and as a model for us, but that has some ethical implications for us on how we should live as we follow. And then, just the last verses in 19 and 20, kind of the last sentence in the English translation that Paul sums it up. For in him all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell, which is a strange phrase, and I think the NIV does a better job of translating this one. But the idea is that the fullness of God, not a piece of God, not a part or a smidge or an attempt. The fullness of God was in Christ. And so there's no need to chase after other things to finish filling out the puzzle, filling up the cup, or anything like that. It is Jesus. It is Jesus. It is only Jesus. So what Paul does, we'll go ahead and do 21 through 23. So what Paul does then is take that hymn and make it applicable for the church that he's writing to. And it transitions by saying the words, and you. And you were once estranged and hostile in mind, doing evil deeds. He has now reconciled in his fleshly body through death, so as to present you holy and blameless and irreproachable before him, provided that you continue securely established and steadfast in faith without shifting from the hope promised by the gospel that you heard, which has been proclaimed to every creature under heaven, and I, Paul, became a servant of this gospel. So kind of what I think Paul does there is recognize that there are people claiming other gospels, other versions of the good news. And so Paul takes a minute to remind them that nothing that he has said thus far, whether in his opening words or in the hymn that he shared with them, is anything different than what they have heard from the beginning. They didn't need more. There was not some missing piece. There was not some greater understanding. There was not some higher level of knowledge that they needed to access. What Christ has done for them is everything they need to know. And I think that can be hard to remember sometimes for us, and so it's no surprise that it might have been hard to remember for them. I think there are lots of reasons that we forget that. And I think sometimes what it looks like is thinking that the fullness of Christ is enough for me, but treating others as if they don't have the same privilege and same access to the fullness of Christ. That shows up in how we talk about others, our willingness to forgive or not forgive. With Paul and the church that he writes to here, there's this reminder that what Christ has done it's what Christ has done that has made them holy and blameless and blemish free, spotless, perfect, pure. And I think all of this emphasis on what Christ has done tells us a little bit about what he's writing against. I get the idea that Paul is writing to a group of people who are either being told and trying to decide if they buy in or not, or the ones doing the telling. I mean, Paul is writing to the people doing the false teaching as much as he is the ones on the receiving end of the false teaching. That it's not about what they do. It's not about what they know. It's not about what they can accomplish, what they can achieve, what they can understand. Everything that makes faith possible and valid and a source of hope has already been accomplished by Christ in Jesus' death and in Jesus' resurrection. That's the fullness of the gospel. And that is the fullness of God's intention for us lived out on our behalf by Jesus. To restore us and bring us together. That was the goal. Which is why Paul writes in verse 23, provided you continue securely established and steadfast in faith, without shifting. There are consequences to rejecting the idea of Jesus being enough. And if they cannot come to remember, if they cannot return to that original understanding that they had, they're going to kill themselves chasing stuff that will never offer any sort of redemption, salvation, fulfillment, hope. It won't do it. Now, for us today, we may not be chasing religious thinking on elemental beings and demons and angels and Jewish food laws, but there are all sorts of ways in which we chase after things that will never fill us up, but we chase after them with religious fervor. And we can talk about very tangible things like money or, status, power. We can talk about security, or a sense of control. Or we can talk about the draw that political power and standing has made itself in our world. The notion that if only everything were just like this, then we would have it fixed. And of course, history is full of people who have gotten exactly what they wanted, only to discover that it was in no way what they'd hoped it would be. And anytime we begin to treat those other things, not necessarily as if they are Jesus, but with the same sort of dedication that should only be reserved for Jesus, then we've put ourselves in a pretty rough spot. And we too will discover what I think Paul is telling the Colossians that if they follow this path, they'll discover, that emptiness is what awaits us. The only thing that is true, that will truly give us any sort of full image of God, is Jesus. And I feel like I've said that about 19 times in class tonight, so I'll say it one more time. The fullness of what we need to know has already been present and been lived out by Jesus. I don't know how many other ways I can say it. And I do that because it's exactly what Paul is doing. It's Christ, it's only Christ. And so, as you read through Colossians, and if you have not done so already, I encourage you to do so. Look at all of the different ways in which Paul tells the people that Jesus is enough, that Jesus is the fullness of God, that Jesus is the completion of what God is doing. Because it's about 100 different ways in, 4 chapters? Yeah, 4 chapters. And it's a good reminder. For all of the other things we might chase, the only thing truly worth chasing is Jesus. All right. Glad you were with us tonight. We will be back at it with the end of chapter 1 and beginning of chapter 2 next week when we get into the mystery of the gospel, which Paul then gives away. So it's not really that much of a mystery. If you read it, you already know what I'm talking about. If you don't know what I'm talking about, that means you haven't read it yet. So get to it. All right, glad you were with us tonight. We will be back at it next week. Same bat time, same bat channel. I will see you then. Y'all have a good one.